Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Phillips Collection and the third week Art Walk when we're open until 8 o'clock. So we're taking that opportunity to organize this panel, which is part of our ongoing series of the Center for Art and Knowledge called Creative Voices DC. The aim is really simple: to bring together creative voices from different perspectives, artists, cultural producers, curious minds, performing artists, practicing artists, curators, etc., to come together and talk about critical issues of today from their own perspective. So my name is Vesela Sretanovic. I'm a Director of Contemporary Art Initiative and Academic Partnership. And once again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Tonight's panel is Born Digital: Art Creating, Presenting, and Preserving. So what was looping in as you were walking out is one of our Born Digital projects by Daniel Kanagar. It was part of our series Digital Intersections, which we started during COVID time because we had to pivot from physical space to the virtual space. So that was looping in as just an example of what Phillips did on that subject. But tonight we're going to tackle this, I call it beast because I'm not a tech person, I'm art historian. Digital art and born digital art, and what does it really mean and how it differentiates from what we call digital art. Touching on manifold aspects of what that is, how it originated as a term. Curiously, it was coined in 1993 by web developer Ronald Metz, who acquired a domain, borndigital.com, kept it for 18 years, and then sold it to another developer. The name stayed. Maybe some of you know more. My coming to this subject is really not from the position of knowledge, but the position of asking questions and trying to learn. So we're hoping that this panel will raise questions, bring maybe some answers, but also give us a fuel to think about what are we facing now going into the future with born digital art. Some of the issues that we hope to address tonight discuss from various perspectives, as I said, from the artists and makers, from educators, from curators, from conservators, are numerous. The content creation and the formal execution, preservation and presentation, innovative design, technological infrastructure with its vulnerability and obsolescence, accessibility, audience expectations and experiences, privacy, intellectual property, sustainability, and as well as to position born digital art between an older generation of post-internet art and the more recent NFT art, and even more scary OpenAI artificial intelligence art generator, or IA Chat GPT. How many of you experience that or use it? Okay, I know that we have some experts in the public, so I'm going to call them out. So we will start with the individual presentation. We have 5 participants, and with their short presentation, using their visual materials. And then the panel will be moderated by my colleague, Patty Favero. And we will have short presentation by them, then conversation among them, and then we will move to you guys, to the public, and to your questions and answers. We have until 8, maybe 8:15, then they will kick us out from here. Before I introduce the panelists, I would like to express my gratitude to all the colleagues who worked with me on making this happen. All my wonderful colleagues, and especially to Franca Basso behind, AV specialist Ashley Whitfield, who is also somewhere in the dark behind, hiding, as usual, at head of public program. The entire MarkCom team who made digital blasts and announcements of this program, our educators, and my colleague Patty Favero. With that, and of course, all the presenters for accepting the invitation to be here and spend this wonderful evening with us. So I will introduce briefly the panelists in the order of their presentation. We'll start with Michelle Herman, an interdisciplinary artist based in Washington, D.C. I gotta say, Michelle, you worked at the Phillips, that's how we got to know each other, whose practice is at the intersection of art and technology. Her work has been shown nationally, internationally, from France, Germany, and here at the Corcoran and many other places. Michelle wears another hat. She's the head of digital experience at the Smithsonian Archives of American Art, where she directs the production, development, user experience, architecture, and strategy of the public-facing Archives of American Art website. She holds an MFA from MICA. Then we're going to go to Marina Isgro, Associate Creator of Media and Performance Art at the Hirshhorn Museum, and who is responsible for the museum collection of media and performance art. Her most recent curatorial projects include Laurie Anderson, wonderful Laurie Anderson, The Weather, and now on view, John at Comfort Purple. So if you haven't seen that, you still have time. She also curated online video series, In the Beginning, Media, Art, and History, and Lost in Place, Voyages in Video. Prior to Hirshhorn, Marina was Nam June Pike Fellow at the Harvard Art Museum, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and the Guggenheim Museum in New York. She earned her MA and PhD in art history from University of Pennsylvania. Then we're going to go to Alex. Alex Miswain. I misplaced your bio. Associate professor. They need to update your website. Okay. Not my fault, the head assistant. Associate professor of Harvard University, from where he received BA in communication design and MFA in environmental design. He teaches across different programs and also wears many hats, teaching in the Department of Art, including electronics studio, graphic design, and photography. Previously, he worked as a freelance designer for companies and clients, including Cushman and Wakefield, and startup magazines. Currently, he is taking a volunteer design projects to help nonprofit organizations in hopes to allow his skills to improve the lives of others. Then we move to Dan Finn, time-based media conservator working at the Smithsonian American Museum since 2015. He also serves as the chair of American Institute for Conservation Electronic Media Group, as well as the chair of the Smithsonian Pan-Institutional Time-Based Media and Digital Art Working Group. That was a mouthful. He also worked at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Democracy Now!, and the Academy of Motion Picture and Science. He holds an MA in Moving Images Archiving and Preservation from New York University. And Julia Kim, longstanding practitioner of end-user research. She's a product manager of, Julia, your title is the longest title I ever seen, much longer than mine if I complain. Okay, so I'm gonna start from the beginning. She's a product manager at the National Library Service for the Blind and Print Disabled at the Library of Congress, as well as a consultant at MIRET, a nonprofit organization specializing in preservation of collections, especially complex-born digital works in smaller institutions. She publishes and contributes widely to various journals, such as Code for Library, thank you, the Journal of Contemporary Archival Studies, and XCon. Kim has BA from Columbia University and MA from NYU in the Moving Image Archiving and Preservation Program. And last but not the least, my dear colleague, Patty Favera, a conservator at the Phillips Collection specializing in painting, but also now managing preservation of the Phillips growing collection of media art. Before joining the Phillips, Patty was completed fellowship at the Cincinnati Art Museum and the Tate. She received her master's degree at the Certificate of Advanced Study in Art Conservation from SUNY Buffalo State in 2002. With that in mind, I turn the podium to you guys. Thank you so much for coming and joining us. And we'll start off with Michelle. Thank you for coming and joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Vesela, for that introduction and for inviting me and the panelists here. And thank you to the Phillips for having us to have these important discussions. As Vesela mentioned, I have two hats that I'm going to be speaking from during this panel today. So one is as a maker of born digital art. I'm an interdisciplinary and conceptual artist based in DC, and I often integrate technology in my work as both a medium and a subject of critique. And I also work a lot with other materials like painting, video, sculpture, and installation. So I'm gonna just quickly, whoops, I should have gone to that one first. So on the screen are just a couple examples of my work. One of the ones in the upper left, it was a commission that was commissioned by the Washington Project for the Arts in 2016. And it used microcontrollers and facial recognition, machine learning kind of technologies to interact with the audience. And then in some of my recent work, I've been exploring AI technologies. So actually this painting on the lower left, it was the original image that it's based off of was a AI-generated image where I trained an AI using Renaissance images that predominantly featured architecture. And then I kind of composed all of the results from that AI generation into this cityscape, and then hand-painted it using 16th century painting techniques, like including how the canvas was prepped. So there's always a sort of like conceptual component to how the materials and why I'm using those materials. And so like with this one particularly, it was the sort of old technology meets new technology. And a sort of more recent one that isn't on the screen, but relates a lot to this panel. I've been commissioned to create a digital piece for the DC Public Library system that's going to be installed shortly at the Fort Totten Lamont Riggs Community Library. So stay tuned for that. So some of the things that I was thinking about in terms of this panel and topic of digital art creation and preservation, I think as an artist who works in technology, especially some of these more tech-heavy works, the interactive works, like the installations, is even just thinking about the idea of how important documentation is. So, there's examples where these interactive pieces, if you don't have sort of instructions on how it's supposed to be assembled later, how do you then exhibit that down the road? And it's something that artists that are working in these medium don't always think about, including myself, and I know I need to probably get better at that. Related to this is also even the hardware itself. So, things can be rendered obsolete, and they change over time. I think some of the other panelists will be speaking a little bit more about obsolescence specifically. But in terms of a sort of personal example, I ran into an issue actually in last fall where an interactive piece that I created in 2017, I went to go exhibit again, and one of the hardware components I needed to replace, and actually the company had changed the way it was designed, which then made the piece not work the way it was supposed to work. And so then I had to kind of shift and figure out the next step after that. And then, so the sort of next hat, the other role that I have is as the head of digital experience at the Smithsonian Archives of American Art. So if you're not familiar with the Archives of American Art, we are a research center at the Smithsonian, and we collect the firsthand papers of American artists. So that means things like sketchbooks, letters, photographs, and more, the kind of material that makes up the story behind the artwork, but not necessarily the artwork itself. And we make these materials available online on our website, which I oversee. And we don't actively collect artwork, or born digital art itself, but the documentation on the artwork creation. And we digitize these materials as much as we can. And we also offer researchers the ability to request materials to be digitized on demand through our digitization on demand service. And so on the screen are actually one of the examples. I thought this was a really interesting example to show for this discussion, because this is actually one of the first examples of documentation on computer art or digital art by Frederick Hammersley from 1969. And so again, this isn't the computer art itself. If you can think about the earlier sort of digital computing systems, they were punch card operated. And so this is an example of a punch card where the artist would essentially layer these punch cards together, feed them into the machine, and then the machine would read those instructions and produce a drawing from it. So you can kind of think about this like early punch card system as in some ways analogous to even the current AI, because in a lot of ways AI, it isn't able to, in most circumstances, do more than perform a set of instructions like the punch card itself. We do collect born digital archival records, but we don't yet have the ability to make those available on our website. So these are usually available on a more case-by-case basis. And so in terms of presenting this material, the public website, some of the issues that we always have to think about, and especially in my role here, is the idea of privacy and accessibility. So we have a lot of records that are often personal materials. Sometimes they'll have social security numbers of artists, and those have to be redacted before they're digitized. And making sure that that information, that PII data isn't let out into the world is important. Even if the artist is not here anymore, having that social security number is important to keep safe. The other issue is accessibility. So the Smithsonian being federally funded, we're required to meet 508 compliance and web content accessibility guidelines. I also, as a artist with disabilities, I think accessibility is incredibly important. So it's something that is personally meaningful for me. But there's kind of issues with born digital archival materials, how those would be presented online. How do you make born digital archival materials accessible in the same way, describing even the interface that allows you to access them. So finally, I'll just kind of wrap up. In both of these roles, something that I kind of grapple with is, being a woman in technology, I think is a common thread. The tech industry is still largely white and male, and that's something that I often have to face. And so I think some of the issues surrounding that is, who has access to this technology, who are designing these products. I think there's been a lot of issues, especially even with AI, where the data set hasn't been representative of enough types of people, and so it's actually ended up discriminating against people who didn't look like the original programmers. And so I think with that, I'm going to hand it off to Marina. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes. Great. So I just want to echo Michelle's thanks to Vessela for bringing together this group of people. It's kind of rare that we get to talk across institutions like this, and I really appreciate the opportunity. So, as you heard, I am Associate Curator of Media and Performance Art at the Hirshhorn. And the media part of that title is sort of intentionally vague. In practice, it refers to anything involving technology. So video, sound art, software-based art, film, like 35 millimeter film, all of that falls under this vague umbrella of media. Right now, our collection comprises about 125 works. It's kind of the smallest part of our collection, which is more than 10,000 objects. But I also think it's the fastest growing part of the collection, and that's really exciting to be sort of in a position to acquire and build this relatively small collection. So I'll just tell you a little bit about my work acquiring and exhibiting digital art. I wanted to start off by talking about one of my favorite works that we have brought into the collection. This is actually the first work that I was able to acquire for the Hirshhorn when I started a few years ago in 2020. And it is on view right now on our third floor if you happen to be in the neighborhood of the Hirshhorn. So this is a piece by Sandra Perry, a young American artist, called Graft and Ash for a 3-Monitor Workstation. And the sort of main feature of this work is the video that you see on the monitor. There's a still of it on the right side. And Perry created this work in Blender, which is kind of an open source animation graphics program. It consists of an avatar that she based on an image of herself. And this avatar delivers a monologue. And what the avatar talks about is actually the experience of being a Black woman in cyberspace. And she talks about the way that issues of race and racism carry over into this virtual space that is supposedly so disembodied. So that relates a little bit to what Michelle was talking about. But what I think is really interesting about this work is the way that it's displayed. So as you can see, this visitor is sitting on an exercise bike while watching the digital video. And Perry actually modified the pedals of the bike so that it's hard to move them. So you're pedaling as you watch this video, and you're just getting more and more tired. And it sort of relates to these themes of exhaustion and fatigue that the avatar is telling you about. So for me, this is a really exciting piece of digital art because it's also very physical while it's digital. And it kind of points to the ways younger artists, I think, are thinking about really unconventional ways of bringing the digital into the museum space. So please stop by and check that one out if you have time. So probably most of the work that I acquire right now is actually born digital video. If you're an artist working in video, you're most likely shooting digital film, which is born digital art, right? If you're working with 35mm film, that's a very deliberate choice that you make these days. So we have a lot of digital video, but we also have a few works in the collection that are generative, that are based on software. So a video is going to be the same. Every time you play it, it loops. It's exactly the same. Generative art is running a program, so it can vary a little bit as it continues to exist. So this is one of my favorite examples from our collection, a work by Sebren Versteeg called Neither There Nor There. And what you're seeing are 2 computer monitors displaying an image of the artist sitting in his studio. And as you watch it, the pixels migrate from one side to the other. There are only enough pixels in this whole work to constitute one image of Sebren, right? So both images are always partial. And what's interesting about this work, I think, like the Perry, is that it's using digital tools, but it's also about the experience of living in a digital world. It's about the way that we're always sort of on our phones while we're talking to our friends, and we're neither fully present physically nor digitally. It's this sense of always divided attention. So when I'm acquiring digital works for the museum, I would say that I'm really attracted to pieces like these 2 that are sort of about the digital and reflect on the digital while they use these new technologies. So as I mentioned, I started at the Hirshhorn actually March 16th, 2020, which was the first day of lockdown. So I was ready to get going with these shows, and then the museum closed for more than a year. So we started thinking a lot about how to show our work online. And digital art, obviously, is sort of the low-hanging fruit in that equation because it translates a little bit better to viewing on a computer screen. So while we were closed, I was able to curate 2 online video shows. And it was a really interesting experience. So I'm showing you just a screen grab from the first one, which was called In the Beginning, Media, Art, and History. which included 12 videos of artists who were approaching historical issues with contemporary technology. I think there were things that I really liked about this format. I liked that actually you could use hyperlinks in the wall text. So, we always have this problem in the museum of like, if people want to learn more, how do we give them more information? And the web makes it really easy to do that. It's also extremely accessible, so people from all over the world were coming to like this website to view these things, which is great. But there are a few disadvantages as well. It was really hard to translate certain artworks to a computer screen. And we found some creative solutions. There was one work that when it's shown in the museum, it's a digital animation on two sides of a screen. So the idea is you can never see the whole work at once. You have to move around and watch each side in turn. So online, we sort of created this little media player that you could, flip. It was sort of a flip animation, and you could go between those two screens but never see them at once. But sometimes, it's hard to do that. It's hard to translate these things to a laptop. But I think the biggest challenge is really viewer attention, because if you come to a museum, you've sort of blocked out part of your day, and you have decided you're going to look at art, and that's what you're focusing on. I think online, you're just competing with so much other content that really getting people to the website and keeping them there is the hardest part. So I'm curious in the Q&A session to hear whether people really like online exhibitions, whether you don't like them, how you feel about them. There are obviously people working on more sophisticated and interesting platforms for virtual exhibitions. There are VR exhibitions, there are all kinds of things online. But I think they all face sort of similar challenges. So maybe I'll stop there and turn it over to Alex.
Good evening again. My name is Alex McSwain. I am the Electronic Studio Coordinator at Howard University. I focus on animation, user experience, and UI. At Howard University, I've taught for 10 years, or 11 years this year, 11 years this year. So I'm an educator at heart. So when you talk about digital born or digital art, I've done it for so long, it's kind of just been a part of me, but I'm old enough and young enough to remember my first computer had a black screen, green text. My keyboard currently is laser light bouncing off my keyboard. Bouncing off my desk. So I've seen the gambit of transition between how digital to analog, with the, you still having to type in, a lot of prompts to get things done, floppy disk, versus now everything's, cloud-based, even though cloud-based is still a physical place, but cloud-based nonetheless. So being in the education arena, I've seen students, the transfer of students, in terms of, I guess, the transfer of power to how because I started teaching when I was 23. So seeing how that class come in versus the class I got now, which is a 2022 class, that just started last semester, you can see a very large gap growing in terms of how the younger generation is handling the digital space and digital art. So for me, it's about staying current. And then with AI, generative art, it's not necessarily a monkey wrench, because it still is nonetheless a tool that we use and we'll be utilizing for years to come, but just I guess in this area. So let's see if this works. So I may skip over this, because this just goes over digital painting. So this goes over the different modes, different styles of born digital art. So digital painting. Again, I'm a professor, so this is one of my students' work by Drake Holmes. He just finished his master's thesis this past week, actually. He graduated. So going over generative art, which is probably what we're all here to talk about. This is the one that's made the most noise and most impact within the past 2 years or so. Then digital photography, obviously this is one of my pieces I did years ago. Digital photography, I remember the shift, because when I started doing photography myself, it was with film. But then, in the 2000s, digital, as technology got cheaper for consumers to use, then obviously now everybody has a digital camera in their pocket. So that is, to me, that's the smoothest transition of art in terms of how we've accepted digital photography versus now AI is seen as, the no-go zone. And digital installations. I'm sure many of y'all may have seen the Vanguard, been to a digital a digital art installation that is immersive, one with using a lot of projection-based and different type of art tools. What does it call it? Projector-based holograms, essentially. Video art. This may work. Yes, this is one of my students' work. She's listed. She is a junior at Howard University. Just digital art, video illustration, animation, film, and then in net art. Obviously, the NFTs have made a big wave 2 years or so. We all have heard of them. I'm sure during the talk we'll talk about the NFTs. Let's hope this works. Is it going to work? So this should, let me see. There we go. You know, is there a way to play the video? You said yeah? Oh no. Okay. Well, so it's the video that I made. It's about a 3-minute video. I kind of wanted to go the gambit. So I've never really used AI art because I've been watching over the years. So never dipped my toes into it. I've encouraged my students to experiment with it because we're trying to, at least on the education realm, we're trying to figure out how to best address this new tool in the classroom. Because I also taught in high school as well. So we're all, since we're all cautious about it. But this semester I challenged students to use it, and they did. So I taught them how to do it. Not old school, but the long way versus doing the quick way, which is 10 to 5 seconds. And they themselves found the difference, and they appreciated what they did more so than what the computer made. And this was a piece that I made this piece. It goes over what digital born art is. So hopefully I can have a USB of it. I can probably show it later, but it just kind of goes over what digital born art is, and then how, in terms of conserving or preserving the artwork, is going to be an issue. Because as you all know, storage media is an issue. Hard drives really only last about 5 years. And you talk about terabytes of data, it's going to be hard to try to preserve. Because even if you have the perfect environment where it's vacuum sealed, those components will eventually break down. Versus a painting that's in storage, sealed up, is going to last probably thousands of years. So this video just kind of goes over that. So, but yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll echo everyone. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you to Vasella and Patty and everyone at the Phillips for organizing this. This is really great. I'm Dan. I work at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. 1 building, 2 museums in Chinatown, us and National Portrait Gallery. We've got about 180 artworks in our time-based media collection, and that Marina did a good job of summarizing that kind of umbrella term. This is a picture on the left of my lab. We can do film inspection, video digitization, born digital, computer-based art stuff also. And then on the right, the London Conservation Center, open to the public. All the other conservators, you can watch them when they do what they do. I'm stuck down the street in a basement, which is where AV people belong. And this on the right here is the first TBMA didactic that has been part of our London Conservation Center to teach the public coming through about basic ideas around media conservation. As mentioned, I also am involved with a Smithsonian-wide group that is concerned with time-based media and digital art. Marina is a part of that group also. And I just want to plug that we have a website, so if you Googled SITBMA and you're curious, you can start to see some real nitty-gritty stuff about documentation templates, case studies, and get into the weeds about how we take care of these things at the Smithsonian. So speaking about my experience, most of that derives from my work at SAM, and so we've got a lot of digital video. This is an example by an artist duo called Girls, Simone Lee and Chitrika Nesh. My Dreams, My Works Must Wait Till After Hell. This was recently on view a couple years ago. We have video games. This is a PlayStation 3 game called Flower. We also have a couple of Atari games in the collection that are homebrew games that were made recently. Then we have really complex installation stuff. This is a work by Namjoon Park, and it is a massive 265 CRTs, 8 different video streams, software, born digital animation, custom analog equipment, so an intersection of a lot of different things going on and complexities. This is another example of a more modern software-based artwork, LEDs controlled by a computer by Leo Villarreal. And, this is called Volume. This is part of the Renwick Gallery, which is also part of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Outside of SAM, I've also done some consulting, sometimes for the Phillips with Julia, sometimes on my own, and I was able to do a project for Collection Sola out of Madrid on an AI artwork. The first one that institution had, and it's a piece by Mario Klingemann called Memories of Passers-by 1, and the AI just does portraits all day. So you could go in the room and you watch the portraits change, and the AI just comes up with new portraits. So you get a sense that born digital art is a very vast field of production. And so with all of the technologies and all the different kinds of artworks, there aren't a lot of hard and fast rules how to care for them. It's often case-by-case basis, is this like cliche in our field. And, but there are some sort of guiding principles and philosophies, and I'd say that one of mine, and I think the linchpin in my conservation philosophy, is to think of media artworks as performances, as performative media, and that like the different technological components are performers. And that opens up a kind of a big window into just how the mindset of media and born digital conservation is different from traditional conservation. This is an example of a painting from our collection by Alma Thomas. And if you're gonna conserve a painting, you're focused on a very unique object. It's a specific canvas with paint on it, and if there's damage to the paint, you treat the paint. You have to understand the chemistry behind all of that. Films, for example, videos, digital files, are not unique objects. They exist in thousands, hundreds of thousands, potentially unlimited copies over the years. And that opens up new techniques. The fact that these things kind of exist outside of a sort of unique, specific physical object. You're more concerned with the experience, and that's what you're conserving, as opposed to physical components. And so some strategies can be different. And this is a piece that's in the Phillips that Julie and I worked on, called Scramble by Leo Villarreal again, and it's LEDs behind these plexiglass screen, and each one of these little squares is a different state of the artwork. It had some problems. The long and short of it is, we opened up the computer. It's an issue with the hard drive. Take out the hard drive, clone it, put in a new one. It's kind of a weird thing. You couldn't really do that with a painting or a sculpture, just like, oh, let's make a new one. It's a strategy, though. And yeah, that's kind of like the 5-minute rundown of my philosophy and basic experience with born digital art. Oh, I'm going to click for you.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Thanks, Dan. My name's Julia Kim. I'm a product manager at the National Library Service for the Blind and Print Disabled at the Library of Congress. I also consult in a number of ways, and like many of the people on this panel, I wear many hats, so it's really great to be in this sort of multi-institutional, multidisciplinary conversation, because I feel like there are already so many threads that we could probably talk on, and I'm not concerned about filling out our time now. So yes, my day job is at NLS, National Library Service for the Blind and Print Disabled, and I support basically access and accessibility, and I'm in charge of an app to allow eligible users, residents, citizens around the world access to content, especially content that is growing now through the Marrakesh Treaty, to address like the book famine. But I also consult. So this slide is a slide from the Myriad website. Myriad is a nonprofit consulting firm that specializes in collections preservation and planning for small to medium-sized cultural organizations. I'm just reading a little bit from that slide, but really, I think we're trying to address, not everybody has a ton of funding, a ton of time. We're not all gonna be big blue chip organizations with a whole team to do this type of complex work. And yet there's so much work being created and so much loss already happening. So this consulting firm is really meant to try to address the smaller organizations that will never be able to do this so-called best or best practices, especially as those best practices evolve and change. We really are trying to, we Myriad and we the field, are trying to change that framework into thinking about what is good enough, how can we plan out ahead, how can we plan for obsolescence in a conversation with the makers and the creators and so forth. So in the midst of this need for constant change, I'm just going to read this quote around this special project that Myriad is on, this NEH sponsored maintenance culture project. But the part of the impetus for this maintenance culture project is this quote, and I'll just read it. The 2019 Heritage Health Information Survey report states that although 40% of U.S. collecting institutions preserve born digital collections, the vast majority, 84%, had no plan for digital preservation, with only 10% of institutions that preserved born digital collections reporting both a plan for digital preservation and a completed condition assessment of these digital records. So that should be a little startling, and certainly was hopefully, for funders and understanding that there's a need here to try to address this. Again, going to more of the broad spectrum of cultural heritage organizations and content creators out there, not just a Namjoon Pak, right, but all the other people out there. So just a minor plug, Myriad is hosting regional events all around the country, actually, over the next few months. And next week's event is at Baltimore on May 23rd and May 24th. It's free and open to the public. And much like tonight's conversation and panel, it's meant to bring together actually creators, people local in the area, as well as people who work in preservation and archiving, and to facilitate a conversation and a skill share to talk about, okay, I use this tool, that's a proprietary software tool, what are the issues here? Or some common concerns are, okay, like we will have to probably internally make a selection of what artwork I can fund and support as my hardware dies. What am I gonna do as I plan out for a potential exhibition in 5 years? So starting to have some of those active conversations to resource share across these disciplines instead. Dan has talked a little bit about the necessarily interpretive nature of complex born digital pieces, or what I'll just call the wetness. And that can be redefined depending on the flexibility of the artist. I thought I would expand on some of this work that we do in the cultural heritage field, and this comes more from my archival background. This is a slide from the federal agency's Digital Guidelines Initiative. It includes many federal agencies, like many of the Smithsonians are represented, as well as the Library of Congress. And in 2019, we published a draft, and I think part of that is because this field keeps changing, of the significant properties for digital video. So this snapshot is just a little bit of a huge Excel spreadsheet that goes well beyond in terms of columns and rows. So beyond that, what you might see in an exhibition about, or the physical properties of a piece that we've seen on some of these slides, that these are the dimensions or the components. From a technical standpoint, we can really dig in much deeper and think about audio channels or the color space or things that are technically significant from my standpoint. If I want to make sure that something a human eye can actually perceive if it's trained, or even imperceptible, but will actually create image loss in the future and might change its meaning over time as people don't really document and pin down what is it? What is the whatness of it, right? So there can be a deep technical aspect to this. But again, this is a draft because things keep changing. So this is a screenshot of a piece I think we already talked about briefly. Dan mentioned it. It's the Villarreal Scramble, and it's actually from his website. And what I think is interesting here is this is embedded, and there's a player embedded within it, so it forwards a viewer from their home some sort of sense or semblance of an experience of seeing the piece at home. You get that sense of the dimensions of the wall, of it glowing. And I think, we've talked about sort of this mediated experience, the pandemic, accessibility screens. So there are a lot of questions here about maybe what is his intentionality in presenting it this way, rather than just having us take up the entire browser screen of a capture of the piece. So compare this to an auction house representation of the work as a few still images that are actually like color-wise probably quite off actually in a perceivable way, as well as a image of the back of the piece that a viewer would never see, right? It would be mounted on the wall, in fact, of the ventilation of the metal and even the power supply. So Dan's mentioned some of the conservation efforts to preserve this bit by bit with that changing out of the physical components and doing that cloning. But what is the piece essentially? We see metal, we see light diodes, but there's obviously much more. And if we look into the file and directory structure, we see there's actually some randomization planned with the different files. So, the question of what is significant, what is authentic, what is the artist's intention, and how can we interpret that? In this case, the artist is alive, active, and there's conversation, but that can't and often isn't always the case. There has to be sometimes some interpretation. And maybe there isn't even that complete documentation that I was talking about to begin with. So lots of problems, but it's a fun thing to sort of, dig around in. But thank you.
So many questions. I'm not entirely sure where to begin. But I think I'm going to jump off from where you left off, talking about these work-defining properties. And as a paintings conservator, when I started learning about time-based media artworks and digital-born artworks, this concept of the identity of an artwork was really interesting. And this comes from the contemporary art and time-based media and thinking about what, as you said, what is the whatness of this artwork? And as a paintings conservator, I don't think I ever thought of like a painting in that way, and now I do, because it just has a longer life. But in thinking about that, so I just wanted to make a comment on that, and then I wanted to start by asking Michelle and Alex, as makers and educators, how do artists, with all of these technologies, like how do your students find the next thing? Michelle, how do you find, I don't think you're necessarily maybe not looking for the next big thing, but how do you find in all of this, everything that's happening so quickly, how do they?
Do you mind? I think, as an artist, I think one of our kind of quintessential characteristics is curiosity, and that's kind of where everything starts. So, just the curiosity of, I think in 2020, so what we know as Chat GPT now, it actually was in 2020 it was called GPT-2, and I had actually been talking with another artist in the DC area who was very involved in technology, and so we were discussing it in terms of what different applications. Essentially, I think I approach things, how can I break it? That's how I like to explore a medium, is how do I break it? And that curiosity. And so for me, that's really the root.
So for my students, I would say social media. That's where they find everything. But for me, I read a lot of tech journals or journals within the industry journals, especially in animation. So, for example, like ChatGPT, as well as when they had the Tupac concert using the holograms, I knew about that 10 years ago because that's what the military used. You know, so it takes time. A lot of tech is developed, but then it takes 15 years for it to become common for commercial use. So a lot of reading, and digital, but a lot more reading versus because my students, we got a printer in the department, and give them go set this up for me. They asked me for a YouTube video on how to set up a printer. I'm like, read the instructions. So this generation is a lot more, I guess with digital, they want to see it versus read it. So I try to get them to dial it back, and then you still have to, not everybody's make a video about what you need to know. So that's how I approach my teaching, because you say you don't need to go to art school anymore. You can just watch tutorials, YouTube videos like that. But they often find that a very specific answer is not going to be found on a YouTube video. So for them, they're kind of realizing, especially my junior seniors, realizing they come in thinking, okay, it's going to be easy, but then realizing, they still need to come to class, they need to participate, and they learn off of each other more so than any digital media is going to be able to give them via video. So that's how I try to keep the digital but physical to make sure that they're still reading their journal, because like Adobe, all these major companies still put out physical materials for them to read about what the latest updates are. So read it.
And trying to push that curiosity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Students do. So, sorry. Following up on that, I get the sense in learning about born digital artworks and just time-based media artworks in general that this is a common thing with artists in terms of pushing this medium just to see how far you can go with it, being very experimental with it. And so my question is for people from institutions, do you have guidelines for what you collect, how you collect? If you'd like to comment on that.
Sure. I think we could take that in lots of different directions. But I guess to start, this is a very practical answer. Every time I am considering a born digital artwork or a time-based media artwork for acquisition, I work very closely with our conservator, Brianna Feston-Brunet. And she actually has a questionnaire that she has developed. And this is very common practice among institutions. And this questionnaire asks the artists for details about how they produce the work, what software did you use, what do you need to display it, but also questions about the long-term preservation of the work. So it'll say, if this software or playback media ceases to exist, are you okay with us migrating it to a different format? Do you have thoughts about what we need to preserve exactly into the future? So having those answers right at the beginning is a real requirement for bringing something into the collection. And there are some artists who are total pros and can fill these surveys out immediately, and then others where maybe they're new to the medium or they're younger, and we'll get on Zoom and talk with them and kind of patch these things out. In terms of newer media, I don't know if we want to go here, but we could talk about NFTs, which I'm sure someone will ask us about in the Q&A. So with really new sort of areas like that, being part of the Smithsonian, there is a lot of conversation that happens within the institution before we're sort of given the green light to bring something into the collection. So Dan and I were both part of a working group about NFTs, considering the implications of what it might mean to bring something that's on the blockchain into the museum. I don't know if you want to answer, and then we'll.
Yeah, our setup is very similar. Saisha Grayson, the curatorial department, is kind of the real engine of what will come into the museum on all fronts. And so when she looks into something and is interested in it, she will loop me in, and we'll start to think about what the challenges are. One thing we try and start to think about is, these things live in iterative phases, and what the life cycle of it might be. Painting, thousands, hundreds of years. A film could be decades. A video could be decades. A app for an iPhone could be 2 years. We had one piece that came in. It's a print that goes on the wall, but it has a component to it that's AR, augmented reality. So when you point your phone at it, on your phone, it triggers a video to play. And the app that supported that died in between when it was acquired and when it went on view. And so that lasted in our collection. It was working for 6 months, and it never went on view
So what's
properly.
the status of it now?
The way that it was shown was, here's the print, and next to it is the video that's supposed to play when you do it on your phone. This is also post-pandemic, and so nobody was going to want to pick up a loaner tab that who knows who else had touched and whatnot. And then with NFTs, this working group was really good experience. Not only think about, what ought we to do, and the really short answer is that we've been doing, from a conservation preservation perspective, the museums have been collecting born digital art for a really long time. And one of the exciting things about the NFT was you can collect born digital art now. But we've been doing that for a really long time, and what you find is that the preservation mechanisms inherent to the blockchains or these kind of marketplaces are not sufficiently robust for what we are looking for for our institutions. And then the other side of that coin being what does it mean in being careful in the world is what it would mean for certain sectors of that marketplace if the Smithsonian buys NFTs and lends that kind of credence to the technology at a time when it's still quite, there's a lot of volatility and untested. Yeah. So no real hard rules, but yeah, we have the questionnaires and being very involved to get a sense of what's it going to take to manage this work over the next, for the Smithsonian, it's supposed to be the life of the Republic. So.
Yeah, I mean, there are certain red flags, I would say.
That's how long that is, right?
Yeah. Proprietary software, technologies where the work is really locked into a certain tech and the artist is not open to migrating in the future. There are definitely red flags, but I wouldn't say that there are any absolute, no-goes.
Yeah, we have this one piece by Corey Archangel that has some rules that I think are quite tongue-in-cheek, where it's a unique VHS is the medium line, which is already an oxymoron, and then and that's the rules, that we can only exhibit it on VHS. And if you know anything about playing a tape, if you had a favorite tape growing up, as I did, you can kill it. And so if we were going to play the unique VHS, we only get so many cracks at it, so it's it doesn't go on view. It's just this weird joke in our collection.
Planned obsolescence.
Yeah.
Planned obsolescence.
Yeah, no, that's a
in
big
sense.
thing.
Yeah. I guess a couple of things to riff off of that. I worked on an archival collection of Jeremy Blake's, and he was in the early 2000s doing early time-based painting, and his process, actually, what we found was that he took together layers using Adobe Photoshop and hired an animator to string them together. So this was not what I was expected as an AV specialist. And then, he passed away, so looking at his intention of how we were going to present emulations or migrations, in an interview I dug up, he said, and I feel like this is a classic artist line, "I don't care, that's not my problem," basically. I'm paraphrasing, but almost the same tone, the same sort of not my problem. I'm going to make what I want to make. You guys have to deal with it. So there's a lot of ways to deal with this. So trying to do that ethically, given the flexibility inherent in this and how things have been presented, is quite resource intensive, as well as there's a lot of sort of interpretive work that happens, which is not something you'd think would happen for somebody who's an archivist or conservator. We're supposed to just make it the way it is and make it not put our hand into it. But actually, there's a lot of our hand in this that is not necessarily clear to somebody like a historian who's trying to do work. And sometimes some of those things, like changes in the pixels or the colors or the interface reacting differently, they don't really care. Even though I spent 200 hours emulating whatever, they're like, I just want it to go faster because I'm used to the way my response rates now are using a computer. So I thought that was interesting. And then there are some inherent sort of mediums like dance. So I used to work at AFC where we we were American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, where dance, performance, ritual, things that maybe are not meant to be open to all people, what do we do with that? But I did a project with the Mark Morris Dance Group, and he's also a choreographer who's well known for sometimes saying, like, we should just burn my archive when I pass away, essentially. And what's interesting about him and his dance performances is, like, he had this vast trove of, like, the last 40 years of, like, it had U-matic, VHS, like every format stacked along each performance, because the performance was closely tied to live music, so you couldn't really capture. There was a uniqueness there as well that I think is really interesting to think about in terms of the sense of variability of the piece, and maybe his sense, and I should have done more research, maybe his sense is there's no point, like how can you even do what you're trying to intend to do, just burn it down. I don't actually know, but perhaps there's something there to that, given the ephemerality of that experience and that performance. On the note of having these conversations in these forums, I wish that happened all the time. It is some people just. I think we are in this together. We all agree on the importance, but sometimes people just want to buy the cool thing, and maybe will pay a lot of money, even though they don't understand, it will take a lot of money to preserve and present it, and it might have a 6-month lifespan or something. So I think some of those conversations still need to be had, and some of that understanding. So I think tonight is, great in bringing this all together, though.
So I still have a lot of questions, but we have about a half an hour left, a little less, and so I'd like to open it up for questions to the audience if anybody has questions. Do we have a plan?
I do have a question, but I just wanted to say there's a microphone. So just please raise your hand, and a microphone will come to you. Thank you.
There are 3 people over here.
Thank you. I don't know. I'm not sure who would be able to exactly answer this, but thank you for telling us what you think of when you're going to buy a video piece. So I have some idea what happens when you lend things to other art museums and institutes for a particular show. What are the things that you'd have to do before you would consider lending a video or an NFT or something like that to another museum for a show?
You can hand it right to you.
That's a good question. I mean, I wish we had a registrar here, because I feel like they would be the right person to answer this, but I can give it a first stab, and then maybe you guys want to add. It's a little bit different from, like a painting where you want to make sure that there's perfect climate control, all of that, humidity control. You want to make sure that they are a trustworthy institution that is going to handle the digital file well, and particularly not duplicate it or spread it around irresponsibly, basically. Because digital art, it is very easy for someone to download a file onto their computer and keep it, right? So I think that's one consideration with lending digital art. The upside of it is that it is a lot easier to ship than. So our registrars are always fine when the requests come in for digital art. But maybe one of our conservation specialists can talk about.
I don't have as much experience with this as my colleagues. I've been at SAM for 8 years, and we've gotten 4 loan requests, and we've been able to do 2 of them. One of them was not allowed because the price got exorbitantly prohibitive. It was a multi-screen big installation, and it was from the 90s, and whatever crates that we had for it no longer passed international freight pest management standards, so we would have had to build all new crates. Anyway, the price tag at the end of the day, which the loaning institution is usually on the hook for, was $80,000 to get it across the Atlantic to Germany, and that just didn't happen. Recently we did one of our Atari games, Halo 2600, and that was, we didn't send anything. We just said they wanted the kind of loaning relationship. And so we said, yeah, you can say you're using from the collection of Sam this video game, but buy your own Atari, buy your own copy. You can still get one. And then we'll just like look at the picture when you set it up and make sure that it's good. The flip side of that is then you send, like for Born Digital, you know, we would send a hard drive or like a link on some FTP or Dropbox or something at the end of the day. And then they have to promise and pinky swear that they're gonna delete it when the show's
exactly.
done.
Yeah, I think you pointed to also an important distinction between works that are sort of tied to the equipment that they're played on and works that are really files that you can just, you know, send on a hard drive or send digitally.
Often you need to have good documentation that you can share with the borrowing institution or vice versa, so that they know how it's something, if it's like an installation, a room installation, they need to know how it's supposed to be displayed as well.
Yeah, that's another thing actually that came up recently at the Hirshhorn, where someone wanted to borrow a very large work that's like 6 channels, so like 6 projections next to each other. And the space that they were proposing to show it in was just not deep enough. There wasn't enough viewing distance. So we had to say no to that because it didn't conform to the artist's wishes for display.
I was actually just curious about the pandemic digital show that you had, and if, like, how did you know, I mean, did you have relationships with all of the artists where they're like, yes, let me do this, it's not substantially changing, or did they have to modify pieces? Because
so I approached, I think, 30 artists total across both shows, and only 2 people said no. And I think that was mostly because it was COVID, you know, so their work was not going to be exhibited in any physical spaces during that moment, so they sort of made exceptions and allowed for it to be shown online. They were time limited, so the works were on view for like 3-4 weeks and then deleted. And yeah, a lot of them did require like translation. So the Sandra Perry, the bike work, we actually included that in one of the shows, but obviously you don't have the bike, which really changes the work. So it was kind of a process of negotiation with these artists to think about, can this work live online? And if so, what does it look like there? Yeah.
Are we okay?
Alarm?
Yeah, it sounds like a fire
I think
alarm
somebody went out the emergency door.
Cool. Just want you to know. First off, thank you all. This has been an amazing conversation. I wouldn't have missed it for the world. And as a digital artist myself and doing stuff, a big thing, and we do projections and a lot of the things, we need electricity. And so we're always constantly thinking about how do we power this stuff? How do we use it? You know, just the elephant in the room is, we're facing climate change. The world is melting because we have too much electricity. There has been a large group of digital artists who refuse to do NFTs because of, I'm glad you really mentioned the fact that there's actually no mechanism to actually store the physical work. So what you basically are buying is a deed to prove that you own the work. Yeah. And there's already mechanisms for that.
Right.
So, but I'm just kind of interested in how, you know, when you look at either shipping or creating, you know, as someone who creates work, I'm always thinking of how is it going to live and survive. But electricity is kind of like the elephant in the room. And like, how much are those kind of conversations in the institutions and you as practitioners? I'd kind of love to hear from everybody if that's cool.
I feel like there's been definitely a change. Like early on, I would always be sort of like, oh no, because there'd be an announcement like, we got all these huge digital collections, Julia, and I'd be like, no, we don't have staff. It's a lot to process. And I feel like that's changed a little bit with an understanding of not only like the work when you don't necessarily have clearly defined documentation, and I'm being given like hard drives, computers, etc., but also sort of how we might move away from some of their field best practices around digital preservation. So one cornerstone is that it must be replicated multiple times in different geographically dispersed areas. in case of, an earthquake or some other more localized regional issue, wherever that data is. I think that practice in the last few years alone is also being called into question in terms of like what might be better or good enough, given the enormous cost. The enormous cost because collecting has become easier in some ways, less seamless. We don't have to ship. Just give me a ton of hard drives. Well, those ton of hard drives still have a physical sort of footprint, right? Especially as we have these best practices around replicating and storing them bit exact in a dispersed fashion. And I think that's also started to call into question some of our sort of aggressive collecting practices. So I think one of the things that comes up with these artist conversations is they themselves struggle with just the financial cost of preservation. So I think there has to be more and more of a sense of selection, not only across institutions around what are we really trying to collect? Do we have a clear purpose? What are our gaps? What are we thinking about in terms of history down the line? But also the footprint. And there are a number of papers and presentations in certainly in the archival world around, if we're thinking, from an archival perspective, we're thinking minimum 20 years. So 20, 40, 60 years, it looks fairly bleak. So what do you do in response to that? It has been a little bit of a crisis, I would say, in some ways for the field if you have that long-term timeline to guide that. So I think that has really started to call into question some of these sort of bedrock guidelines.
So we just go this way if everyone's going to answer. Yeah, I agree that the field, or my corner of the field, I think everyone is having, it's an existential problem, and we are having a sort of existential crisis over it. There's this like professional association, American Institute for Conservation. They'll have the annual meeting where we all talk and present to each other on what we're working on. And there's one, it's going on right now actually. And last year's, there was a panel where basically towards the end of it, a bunch of conservators in a room being like, should our field even exist? Like, what are we doing? And just another quick, I'll try and make this as quick as possible. We have an artwork that has LED lights, and we have a preventive and it was a picture in my slide of all the lights on the wall. That wasn't the artwork. That is a preventive conservation measure so that when the lights in the piece itself die, that I can replace one with one that's been burning for 5, 6, 7 years. And it will match the tonality better than if it's never been used, which creates this kind of patchwork issue, which means in a sense that we're just kind of like throwing energy away to like get it to look great. And so my opinion is that just the grid needs to be as clean as possible. And that kind of thing, it's like, there's a lot of this conversation that is always like personal responsibility, take it upon yourself. And I think there's a lot of powers that, I understand I get crazy here, but I think there's a lot of people that profits if the conversation is that, and not like, what are the giant top-down decisions that would transform it overnight? That would just like some people need to grow up and make those decisions.
DC has an energy crisis. My background is actually environmental engineering before, I guess, parallel to me doing art. I used to work for DDOE, District on the Environment. So looking at DC's energy grid itself, that's why there's a lot of solar farms in the area popping up now. To where, all these buildings, if you look in the summertime, everybody's cutting on AC, DC gets hot, the island effect that happens. DC gets blackouts in a lot of areas of the city. So when you talk about energy required to even make art, it is, when the thing really hits the fan, art in the moment is going to be the last thing on somebody's mind. But as we are now, I think we're able to preserve our own art for locally. So what I do as an artist is I have photography going back almost 20 years. That's film and digital. So every 5 years, I buy a brand new hard drive and just transfer everything over. Because I know realistically, the older hard drives, the spinning disk hard drives, 5 years, you start hearing that clicking, all of a sudden you lose everything. Flash drives are about 10 years, 10, 15 years. So the flash media, or flash storage is longer. So I would say as an artist, make sure every so often you're just transferring everything you have, your entire, days, weeks, but it's always good to have multiple backups of your work personally, like I do. And I'm talking about students, just because it's on the cloud, because basically, the cloud is really just a giant cord in the Atlantic Ocean going between continents. There's only 8 satellites that all these network towers talk to, so there's really not that much tech up there in the quote-unquote cloud. It's all physical storage based around the area that you live in. So I would always tell them to physically, Apple iCloud, Google Drive, yes, but also make sure you're investing in your own local servers in your house. Because if you have, if you're making digital art, digital photography, especially doing film and video, those files get large quickly. So I tell them, invest in something where you have control over, because you never really know when the light's going to go out. So.
Great advice. I guess I can just add a couple things from a sort of curatorial and exhibition perspective. This is a conversation that we're constantly having at the museum. How do you fulfill our mission of exhibiting contemporary art while also being environmentally conscious? And we're trying out different things. So the Jana Conference show right now that I mentioned is carbon neutral. We offset it through donations. I mean, that's obviously not perfect, and there's a lot to critique about this whole world of carbon neutrality, but I think we're trying things. We're trying it as a pilot. Other things that we do are trying to reuse equipment rather than buying new equipment every time a work comes in. So sometimes artists are really, really wedded to like a particular media player or a particular projector. As much as we can, we try to get people to agree to the projectors, the pool of equipment that we have, so that we're not just accumulating more and more tech that's going to become obsolete very quickly, as you've heard. The NFT question, we spent a lot of time talking about that one and thinking about whether the sort of environmental damage of the blockchain was a sufficient reason to not collect NFTs at the Smithsonian. I think the shift, not to get too technical, that happened with Ethereum, shifting to proof of stake rather than proof of work, sort of alleviated some people's concerns. But yeah, we're still talking about it, and we don't really have concrete final answers yet. Yeah.
And then I guess me as a maker, maybe I'm a little lucky in that I don't have to think so much about exhibiting it in perpetuity. None of my work has been up until this point very power intensive. But it's smaller components. I've tried to really try to leverage, especially when I'm using devices that if they require a battery, I make sure I wire that so that I'm not throwing out a battery, right? I can use some kind of rechargeable or more sustainable device than like a throwaway battery. Where was I going with this? I'm interested in, there's a lot of artwork now which kind of like solar panels where they are self-sustaining, like even a lot of eco art where the energy that the piece is actually creating helps to power itself, and I'm interested in exploring how that could become even just like a conceptual component of how it's becoming this sort of iterative loop. So yeah, it's something that I think about. I think with my work, I really only ever have to worry about it being powered for the month month or two that it's in an exhibition, not yet being in a Smithsonian or other institution. That hasn't happened, or it's not an issue that I've had to address yet, but I'm interested in thinking more about it.
Yeah, my name is Joel Crooms. I'm a digital artist from Washington, D.C. And when I first came, I was excited about what you guys were talking about. But I'm even more excited because I realized that you don't know much more than me. Yeah. That's not to take away from anything. But what it means to me is the medium is so democratic that unless you're doing something like George Lucas is somebody where you need a lot of stuff. I work with young people. I teach them how to use medium to survive in my community and stuff. And having grown up as an artist, painting and everything, I found that computers are like the great equalizer. I'm as excited about it as probably people were with the Gutenberg Bible. That's how flexible it is. I have like young people who teach me stuff like, you talk about the young people you know at Howard and different places. And with COVID was really like a serious explosive container and stuff. I had so many young people interacting with me online, and I even have a nephew who does, what is it, e-games?
Yeah.
And he makes like probably more than all of us in here stuff playing.
Oh, he's like professional?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, yeah. And his mother taught at Howard, as a matter of fact. Stuff. But I'm just really excited to see that you're trying to solve a problem, but you haven't come up with an answer yet. And for myself as an artist, I can see myself developing as well or as far as anybody else and stuff. And that's all I had. I had some questions, but you answered my question.
There's a bunch of them.
Thank you. I guess I just want to follow up with what Alex was answering the question about storing files in the future and retrieving them. And what I do is a lot goes to print, but then I do like to have my files, especially Illustrator and Adobe Photoshop files in the future in case I need it. And I was just a little concerned about, you said the cloud is not that is dependable. So what would be your recommendation? I mean, is there another external hard drive that people can offload that like you could recommend, like a product or something that you could recommend that you know, that you could store files? You say it's only 5 years on a flash, 10 years on a flash drive, and 5 years on a hard drive. That's kind of scary to me because that was the main reason why I came here tonight, was to find out the answer to those questions. So, thank you.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, the cloud is reliable, but it never is always to keep put all your eggs in one basket analogy. So it is in terms of specifics, like Western Digital hard drives. Those those are pretty good. So I would say because tech is relatively good these days. So if you're cycling out every so often, then you shouldn't have an issue with storing your media. And Adobe itself does it. I mean, I went to Adobe's. I went to headquarters out in Salt Lake this past winter, and their complex is amazing. So they have a lot of AI that actually preserves the art within the cloud itself. So they have the machine learning running and also maintaining the images that they store on their own servers. So it is. So Adobe. So in terms of I guess Adobe is the monopoly. It's Western Digital. Yeah, digital. Yeah.
As somebody who has actually had the unfortunate experience of losing a good chunk of your work, it was undergrad work, so I guess it's in retrospect not as awful. But I'm now in both my art and in my work. At the archives, I think you have to have a backup on a backup on a backup. So I back up to the cloud, and then I have 2 separate hard drives that do time machine backups on a schedule. And so if one of those fails, I know that I have 2 more that I can grab the material from. Yeah, I mean, I'm upgrading my hard drives all the time. You actually, Alex, reminded me that I need to replace. I was like, oh man,
I know, I'm thinking
one of those is making that noise.
Yep.
It's making that clicking noise. The other newer one that I just got last year is fine, but I've been staggering them, so I'm not replacing all of them at the same time, so that it helps to kind of mitigate that cost, but staggering that
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and being in an archive that really handles that kind of concept, I do think about it even more now. And so I've been, cataloging my own materials, and I'm thinking, I've actually told my husband that, when I die, you will be responsible for all of this. and I'm going to have to give him instructions. But yeah, it is something to think about. What's that?
That your instructions will be shortly obsolete.
Right.
Yes, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. There seems to be an emerging consensus that an interactive installation can be a game, and good high-quality games can be art.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you prevent the dumbing down of the institutional mission if this stuff grows and grows and grows? I mean, there has to be some sort of quality, not measurement, but some sort of quality standard by which you would bring this stuff into an institution. And I wondered if there's been any discussion about that yet.
Well, that's Marina's job.
Yeah,
to
that's
be
a
able to
giant question. That's
find out what's good.
That was sort of my question about like guidelines too. Like
aesthetic
how you
guidelines,
decide
yeah.
what you collect. In a
That's a really hard question, and it is very subjective. And there's no getting around the subjective part of it. I think right now the solution is you hire people who have studied art history for many years and have looked at a lot of art and continue to look at a lot of art. Talk to artists, go to art fairs, go to museums. As you consume more and more art, you develop a sense of what art is more complex and more interesting and more engaging. And I think that's a skill that you can apply to paintings or that you can apply to digital art and new formats, right? There are certain, with the examples that I brought, I was trying to show that you need to have a compelling, I don't want to say message because that's a little bit reductive, but some compelling idea or concept behind the work that is motivating the use of the technology, right? I'm not going to buy artwork just because it's using the newest thing, and it's just a novelty. It has to be an artist who is taking that technology and sort of turning it in an interesting way. Like you talked about, breaking the technology, pushing against the technology, sort of commenting on the technology. So I think that's the best answer that we have right now. There are also sort of consensuses that develop in the art world. There are galleries and there are institutions. So certain artists get shown over and over and over and develop reputations and become known. And those people might be seen as sort of a more reliable bet for an acquisition than someone who's completely new. But in some, it comes down to just subjective judgments by experts. Yeah.
We're talking recently. Saisha Grayson is curator of time-based media at Smithsonian American Art Museum, and I discussing this idea. And on top of all the considerations Marina's talking about, of course, also adding into that, we aren't going to take in an artwork that is published by Nintendo or PlayStation. It's this major, massive, giant. We're not going to do the blockbusters, right? We're going to look for independent creators, small things, and that is just an outlook of being the giant producers can preserve their stuff, and that it's debatable whether they do a good job of doing that, but it's up to that's their job.
Well, I think it's very much art reflects our time and our world right now, and you've got students who are working in all different media. They may be painters, they may be photographers, they may be doing film, but they're probably doing digital, so it's finding, like you said, finding who is saying something compelling in whatever medium in order to grow your collection.
We are running out of time. We have time for one more question. Please.
Thank you guys so much. It's very awesome to hear everything. I'm Gen X, so I grew up not having a computer, and I remember having a computer, but I also remember being at the Louvre and seeing Mona Lisa and having this visceral reaction. First of all, it's so small, disappointing, but also it's a beautiful painting. I'm thinking about the future, and so how does digital and physical, and how does all of this live together going forward? Is it the metaverse, or how do you see people kind of, interacting with art and having these visceral reactions? Does that make sense? Yeah.
I have a
big one. You go.
We are undergoing a big renovation in our museum right now. It's going to be top, and there's a lot of things going on. But we have the Luce Foundation Center, And if nobody's been there, it's a really nice place to go. It is just this hidden corner of our museum that is open storage. There's just racks and racks and racks of paintings and sculptures. And we had these people come in as like consultants to say like, oh, what ought we do during the renovation process? And they said, oh, in the Luce Center, you need a maker space where you have all your computers and people to do stuff. And like those can be really cool, but the pandemic happens and that idea is just like, okay, everybody's tired of looking at screens. They want this analog, quiet, yellow light place to go to and just look at stuff and have it be quiet for a minute, you know? Like that can just be that kind of a space. And so I think there's always gonna be a value to seeing, you know, film looks different from digital video, and if the extent that that is still like a small corner of the market, it's great to go see films. I think digital videos looks great. I think film looks great, and they look great in different ways. You know, like vinyls are being sold more popularly now. Digital audio is fantastic. Vinyl sounds cool too. Like it's just, there's always gonna be these markets. One, I don't think is better or worse or whatever, but they are different, and there are people that appreciate the thing for what it is. And I think there's room for that, and hopefully that stays to be the case.
I guess my tiny comment is, as somebody who works in accessibility, I see a lot more possibilities to embrace different experiences and not have all these assumptions built in when we design an exhibit or when we have like a reference room for somebody to come in. There are many assumptions that leave out many people from ever feeling comfortable or even being able to come into that space. And you know, what we heard about an amazing show during the pandemic or the metaverse, like I bought my parents a VR headset because I could communicate with them, but they also are not comfortable, you know, working out at a fitness center. And we could have designed accessibility controls for them to do something that was more tailored to what they can do in their late 70s with their disabilities. So, you know, it's a much more potentially welcoming space, and there's a lot of conversation right now with AI, helping many of my colleagues and blind patrons, for example, navigate the world without having to call on and rely on a person. They can have, you know, AI point out impediments or help them navigate the space independently, sort of with more dignity, I would say. So I think there's a lot of dangers, and I'm, you know, cautious, of course, but it is also an exciting time if you work in accessibility.
I think also, being a digital artist, so if I wasn't a digital artist, I don't think I would purchase a digital painting to hang it in my house. I would rather buy a sculptural piece. So I think it's really about preference. You know, some people would, you know, because you think about digital painting, you have to buy a screen, and you got to plug the screen in somewhere, you know, so there's a person in place for every piece of art that's created. Much like, you know, somebody that would prefer walking the beach versus going on a canoe on a lake. So I don't think they can coexist. I don't think they need to combat, even though I think in the bigger, the bigger conversation is, you know, which one will win out. I think the actual conversation is how are they going to coexist, because everybody has preferences. So.
Also, as an artist, like I think personally, you know, in my work and what I've sort of seen and what I'm thinking about, it does seem like the sort of longer term trend of how digital intersects is that it will have to become more part of our physical space and our physical environment in more AR and projection and those kind of medium where you're not in front of a screen, you know. I think there is a sense of digital fatigue that we've all kind of experienced, especially in the last 3 years, that there is going to be an increasing need of integrating it into the physical spaces. And so I'm really excited to see how that plays out.
And I think, even so at Howard, we have a lot of students that are going back to doing film versus digital.
Yeah.
Cool.
So even you look at Hollywood, a lot of the studios that, you know, Star Wars is one, or I guess Disney, you know, them, they often acquire, or they often have a lot of practical effects in their films versus CG, even though the CG has advanced so far since, you know, the original ones came out. So I think there's a balance to where once we get too far over, we'll come back, you know, closer to the other side, then we'll center out.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. But I think, yeah, Michelle, I think the real question is like, how does the digital become more physical? Because I agree with Dan that people still want to, make a day out of going to a museum, to get out of the house, get away from their screen, right? But I think we're seeing more and more things like, I think you showed the immersive Van Gogh slide. Like that's digital art, right? That's a digital video projection.
Right.
But it's also very much about like being in the place and sort of being with other people and watching it together. So I think we're gonna see more and more of that.
There's the Art Tech House.
Yeah, exactly.
Waterfront.
Yeah.
I think we're at that point that we need to round this up. I'm grateful to all of you participants. Thank you so much for raising the questions, providing answers. But again, the point of the panel was really, we're living this fast-paced time and technology is moving so fast. And we're not here to provide answers. We're here to question, keep questioning and readdressing the same issues as we are all living in this digital age. So thank you all for coming. Thank you again and have a good evening.